Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into a life that burned incredibly bright and incredibly fast. We're charting the literal meteor path of Alexander the Great. To give you a sense of the sheer scale we're dealing with here, by the age of 32, this single individual had conquered the entirety of the known world. He forged an empire that stretched from Greece all the way to northwestern India, and he did it without losing a single battle. It's an almost unbelievable story of ambition, raw power, and an enduring legacy.
Okay, let's dive right in. We'll start with his early life and education, move on to his ascension to the throne, hit the pivotal Battle of Gaugamela, push through his final campaigns, and finally look at his sudden death. It's a massive epic, so let's get going.
Section 1. Early Life and Education, the Foundation. The sheer velocity of his early life is just staggering. We go straight from his childhood into a world-class education. And when I say education, I mean he was personally tutored by Aristotle. Imagine having literally one of history's greatest minds teaching you science, medicine, and philosophy. Actually, Alexander was known to sleep with a copy of Homer's Iliad, annotated by Aristotle himself, tucked right under his pillow, right next to his dagger. He was also fiercely determined from the get-go. He famously tamed the wild, massive horse Bucephalus when absolutely no one else could. That's the same horse that would ride into battle with him for decades. But he doesn't just stay a student. He's quickly thrust into the role of regent, managing Macedonia while his father is away. Then the timeline fractures. A bitter falling out with his father, King Philip, forces him into exile. He literally has to flee for his life before negotiating a tense return. So he cycles through these immense life-altering changes before he even gets close to the throne.
And that brings us to a massive shift in identity. On one hand, we have the heir of Philip. For context, King Philip II was a brilliant military strategist who basically united Greece and built the legendary army Alexander would eventually use. But navigating Philip's court, that was a deadly game of political chess. Alexander had to survive conspiracies, rival heirs, and the constant threat of assassination. On the other hand, the paradigm completely flips when he becomes the king of Macedonia. When his father was assassinated, Alexander didn't just passively inherit the crown. Going from surviving a kingdom to ruling one required ruthless tactics, a brutal consolidation of power, and immediate military campaigns to prove he wasn't just some weak boy king, but a highly lethal force.
Section 2. Ascension to the throne, seizing control.
So how exactly does a 20-year-old secure a completely fractured kingdom? Well, he executes a rapid, multi-step plan to lock down his borders from every side. Ascension is just the title. Consolidation of power is the internal lockdown. And the Balkan campaign is the external message. He didn't just sit back on his new throne. He immediately marched north to crush rebellions from the Thracians and Illyrians. The surrounding territories thought this young, untested king would be easy prey. But by decisively crushing those uprisings, he secured his northern borders and sent a crystal-clear warning to anyone thinking of challenging his new regime.
Let's look a bit closer at the sheer brutality of that consolidation, because simply gaining the title of king was only step one. To survive, he had to silence challengers immediately. He ordered the execution of potential rivals to the throne, leaving absolutely zero room for a counter-coup. And when the prominent Greek city of Thebes rebelled, thinking they could finally break away, Alexander didn't just defeat them. He completely razed the city to the ground, sold the survivors into slavery, and spared only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar. It was a horrifying, calculated move. In the blink of an eye, he transformed from a returning political exile into an uncontested, terrifyingly effective military commander. Greece was completely subdued. Now, he could look east toward the massive Persian Empire.
Section 3. The Battle of Gaugamela, the apex.
When we talk about the absolute apex of military history, we are talking about Gaugamela. This is where Alexander faced the mighty Persian king Darius III. The scale of this conflict is almost unimaginable. Darius had actually leveled the battlefield beforehand, so his scythe chariots could run unimpeded, and his forces vastly outnumbered the Macedonians. Some ancient sources suggest a crazy numerical superiority of 5-1. The dust kicked up by hundreds of thousands of men and horses must have literally blotted out the sun. But Alexander executed this brilliant, incredibly dangerous tactical wedge formation. He drew the Persian flanks outward, created a gap in their center, and then personally led his elite companion cavalry right through it, charging directly at Darius himself. The Persian king fled, his army shattered, and the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which had ruled for over 2 centuries, was effectively destroyed in a single afternoon. It is without a doubt the apex of his conquests.
But that brings up a pretty fascinating dilemma. When you've reached the absolute apex of the known world, where do you even go from there? After Gaugamela, where does a conqueror go?
Section 4. The final campaigns. The unrelenting march.
That relentless energy of his youth is still there, but now it transforms into something much more grueling. We aren't just talking about winning tactical battles in familiar territory anymore. It's about pushing further and further into the absolute unknown edges of the map. He marches his men through brutal deserts, over the freezing Hindu Kush mountains, and straight into India. And here, they aren't just fighting other men. They're facing massive, terrifying war elephants and relentless monsoon rains that rot both their armor and their spirits. If you want to understand human drive, this phase perfectly illustrates what happens when ambition completely consumes an individual. I mean, Alexander famously named over 70 cities after himself, and even one after his beloved horse. There was simply no stopping for him. But there was a breaking point for his men. Finally, at the Hyphases River, exhausted, drenched, and thousands of miles from home, his fiercely loyal army simply refused to go any further. This unrelenting march wasn't halted by an enemy, but by the sheer limits of human endurance.
Section 5. Death of the Greats. The meteor crashes.
Death. That's it. Just like that, the story stops. After an impossibly fast, continent-spanning journey of nonstop momentum, the whole thing comes to a sudden, jarring halt. Alexander was just 32 years old. He was resting in the ancient city of Babylon, actually planning his next massive campaign into Arabia. But a sudden, mysterious fever took hold. Within days, the man who conquered the known world was paralyzed and couldn't even speak. The mystery surrounding his final days still sparks fierce debate today. Was it malaria, typhoid, or maybe poison? We might never know for sure. What we do know is that he died without leaving a clear heir. When asked on his deathbed who his vast empire should go to, he famously whispered, "To the strongest." It's one of the most abrupt endings in recorded history, and it instantly plunged his generals into decades of bloody warfare over the scraps of his empire. It really highlights just how fast and hot this meteor burned before it finally hit the earth.
But while the man stopped, his legacy certainly did not. To understand a life this brief yet explosive, scholars have spent millennia gathering primary accounts, debating secondary theories, and compiling massive archives of historical data. His life basically created an endless library of human fascination. We're still untangling the myths, the tactics, and the sheer psychological drive of a leader who actively reshaped the cultural and political map of the ancient world. The vast documentation left in his wake proves that his impact wasn't just geographical, but absolutely foundational to Western and Eastern history alike. Which leaves us with one final thought to ponder today. When you look at the whole trajectory of his life, the rapid education, the brutal consolidation of power, the apex at Gaugamela, and that sudden, jarring end, how does a life burning this brightly echo through history? I hope this explainer has sparked your curiosity to dive into those historical sources yourself and find out. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep learning.